In art, it's always important to have a sense of balance. Warm and cool colors, dark and light values, details versus minimalism, and most importantly, hard and soft edges. Unfortunately, I am not a professional by any means. And looking at my art, it's clear that I need a lot of practice to master this skill. But though good artists copy, great artists steal. So I locked in and I started a new art challenge, the 7-day hard brush challenge. I did studies from both professional artists as well as real-life photos, using only hard brushes for 7 days, with a different category and multiple studies for each day, and I'll be sharing everything that I learned during the process. I used Procreate for each drawing, all the real-life references came from Pinterest, and the brushes that I used are all linked in the description. On day 1, I chose a real-life reference to do a study from. This was done to focus on identifying all the categories I needed to work on and to set a benchmark for improvement. The hard brush challenge is one that forces you to communicate the same thing as your reference of choice, but you're only allowed to use visible strokes with defined edges. Thus, it will push you to improve on your shapes, have confident strokes, and teach you how to learn to simplify your work. The end result had visually appealing colors and textures. However, I still had a long way to go. I let myself use textured brushes to make the colors appear smoother, but I took away this privilege for all the following studies. To restrict myself further, I also only allowed myself to use these hard brushes at 100% opacity. Now that I had a point of reference and knew which areas of art to work on, it was time to do the studies. On day 2, I focused on the rendering of the eyes. I studied the work of Matcha, choosing these 2 references to try to replicate. Initially, I thought that I would do only 1 study per category, but I quickly realized how many fundamental skills I lacked. So, for each category, I decided to do multiple studies of different artists in order to push myself as much as possible. Matcha's art has a lot of beautiful colors and color transitions, likely done by layering colors with soft brushes. But since I added the 100% opacity restriction, this meant that layering colors was not an option. So, to replicate this effect, I would place down 2 colors and zoom in until I could see the middle colors between them. Then, I picked the midtone of my choice and placed it in between these 2 colors. This provided a gradient effect, while still using hard brushes. I continued to use this method while rendering the eyes, adding random brush strokes to create an illusion of detail on the way, and utilize layer modes, such as add and overlay to adjust the colors. This is what my 2 studies ended up looking like. On day 3, I studied how to paint the hair and ended up struggling a lot. I first did a study of Rogan Joel's Kafka illustration, making sure to put as much detail as I could, but it ended up looking like a big mess. I tried to use layer modes to make the colors more accurate to the reference, but this caused the colors to become more muddy and undefined. Unhappy with this result, I moved on and did some more studies. I first did value studies of the references, using only 3 to 4 values per study, then moved on to the actual studies. Through this process, I realized I'd gotten so obsessed with rendering every little detail and matching the colors to the reference, when the most important thing I needed to learn was how to effectively use shape and value. I began focusing more on the form of the hair, using brushes and tools to communicate clear, defined shapes. After these studies, there was a clear improvement. The messiness and muddiness had decreased, and I was able to better communicate the same detail without overwhelming the viewer. Once I felt like I'd mastered the hair to a certain extent, I did a study from a real-life reference, combining the things that I learned from my hair and eye studies. But this is only the beginning because we need to work on clothes next. For my first clothing study, I used a real-life reference photo as a benchmark. I had a lot of trouble with this study. My anatomy ended up being really inaccurate, even after breaking down the reference into shapes, and the folds and the colors on the clothing were really messy and soft. Without even realizing it, I focused on over-rendering instead of the overall piece once again. So, for the following studies, I decided to change my approach. Instead of just simply painting whatever I saw, I'd go from bigger shapes to smaller shapes, adding false detail along the way. The references that I chose were really overwhelming. There were so many brush strokes, different colors, and small details, but I reminded myself to stay focused on the overall drawing, keeping myself accountable with methods such as zooming in less so that I wouldn't get as distracted and over-render, and use the lasso tool to create big and sharp shapes. Compared to the first clothing study, my redraw of it was a huge improvement. The proportions were more accurate to the reference, my edges were a lot sharper, and my shapes more defined and less muddy. I also stylized the colors to be more visually appealing. I was really proud of my progress since I'd gotten this far with just a few studies. But this challenge isn't just over yet. It's time to move on to day 5, lighting. Lighting was an area that I was really scared to take on. I'm not fundamentally strong in this area at all, and lighting scenarios are full of soft edges that I wouldn't be able to reproduce. I started out with a benchmark study of this reference, trying to combine all the techniques that I learned so far, but once I started doing studies, this time from the works of Redrawing and Rella, things got really stressful. If this challenge has taught me anything, it would be that line art is not for me. I tried to reproduce the same shadows and line work as Rella, but due to her use of soft brushes, my study couldn't recreate the same effect. I am pretty proud of the study I did on Redrawing's art though. It was pretty hard for me to try to incorporate an art style with line art, something that I rarely do with a more painterly approach. Most of my studies ended up looking like a mess between these two art styles.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because
I might have not developed my skills a lot fundamentally, but my perception skills did improve a lot. Studying the work of these artists helped me see the shapes and values in my reference more clearly, even when lighting was, and still is, a difficult area for me to attempt. And that's completely okay. Improvement takes time. It's bound to come eventually, as long as you stay committed and dedicated. The redraw of my first lighting study wasn't as much improvement as I'd hoped for, but I did develop and stylize my work further, refining my shapes and shadows. And finally, the dreaded day 6 came, backgrounds. For my photo study, I tried to use line art. I thought that it'd make things easier, but everything just ended up looking muddy and messy once again. I had no idea how to paint in water, and was kind of just randomly placing brush strokes everywhere. The gradient in the background was incredibly difficult to draw without soft brushes, and the color adjustment layers I'd used to try to make everything look better just made it look worse instead. I didn't like the study at all and knew I needed to improve, so I did studies on Redrawing's work once again. My general process for these background studies was to do the base sketch in line art, map in colors and shapes with the lasso tool, and go into further detail from there. The lasso tool was the MVP for this challenge, just like it was for my 30-day background challenge. It allowed me to create different shapes easily with hard edges, and with the lasso fill tool, I was able to save time on my base colors. Throughout this challenge, I realized that simplicity is key. I realized the importance of communicating the focal points of your illustration in as few shapes and strokes as possible. As artists, we're bound to believe that the more detail we put, the better. But a balance of detail is extremely important. Falling into the trap of putting too much detail is really easy to do, but it can end up distracting the viewer from your art's main focus or message. So, the best thing you can do is to minimize the detail or add in false detail in less important areas while maximizing your focus and effort on the main points of your drawing. I try to apply this to my studies as much as possible. They may look detailed from afar, but if you look closer, you'll see that I just used some big brushstrokes to communicate different shapes and colors. With this in mind, I did my last background study, choosing to paint the background before the character, blocking in the basic shapes and refining further, and just avoiding line art altogether. I spent a lot of time making my forms clear and proportionate to the reference, and adjusted the colors to be more saturated and visually appealing. The result was a great improvement compared to my first attempt at backgrounds. My shapes were a lot clearer, there was so much less muddiness, and I was able to depict an illusion of detail while minimizing the amount of brushstrokes. And now, it was time for day 7, the final redraw. For day 7, I tried to apply everything that I learned throughout the challenge. I did thin line art like Rella, added in different colors like turquoise and orange, and a lot of detail on the eyes like matcha. Used big shapes to render the hair and refine further like Redrawing, and added in detail and render like Redrawing. And finally, since I really liked how my illustration for day 1 had all these cool colors, I tried to incorporate similar colors, adding a piece of my own style and technique into this study. I struggled a lot with the anatomy and hair, trying to achieve a balance in the detail, but I really enjoyed the overall art process. Going into this challenge, I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know how much I'd improve or how hard it would be. I was limited to using tools and studying areas I wasn't familiar with. But with limitation comes opportunity and growth. I learned a lot of valuable lessons throughout this challenge, and will be applying these techniques in my future illustrations. And, as promised, here's what day 7 looks like compared to day 1. Even though this challenge is called the 7-Day Hard Brush Challenge, it definitely did not take me 7 days. Life happened. School happened. I started my sophomore year of high school, and it got harder to find time to draw and work on this challenge. But I still committed to this challenge, working on it whenever I had the time to. my studies weren't exact copies of the reference, and I still have a lot to improve on. What's most important though, is that I did my best for this challenge. Even if it was difficult, I saw this challenge to the end, and that is what I'm really proud of. If you're looking to challenge yourself or learn some new techniques, I definitely recommend doing this challenge. Trust me, you won't regret it. If there's any types of videos you'd like to see from me, please let me know. But if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, I hope you learned something new, and that you have an amazing day.